Good evening and welcome back to Mythic Dreamscapes. Tonight we're journeying to the frozen peaks and windswept halls of the Norse cosmos to meet one of the most complex, most powerful, and most misunderstood figures in all of mythology. This is the story of Freyja, a goddess who wears more faces than the moon, whose tears fall as gold, whose magic shaped the fate of gods themselves. So before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Maybe grab a blanket, dim the lights, let the world outside fade away. Pour yourself some tea if you'd like. Get comfortable in your favorite spot. Let your shoulders relax and your mind quiet. And if you're enjoying what we do here, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, but only if it genuinely brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see who's drifting off to these old tales across the globe. Someone in Tokyo at dawn, another soul in London at midnight. Perhaps you're in California as the sun sets, or in Sydney as morning breaks. Wherever you are, you're part of this strange, wonderful community of myth seekers and story lovers. Now close your eyes if you'd like. Let your breathing slow. Feel the weight of the day lifting from your shoulders. And let's step into the world of the Vikings, where gods walked battlefields, where magic was real, and where a goddess named Freyja ruled over love and death with equal measure. Picture, if you will, a world of 9 realms, all connected by Yggdrasil, the great world tree whose roots delve into primordial wells and whose branches stretch into the heavens. In this cosmos, the gods were not distant, untouchable beings. They were passionate, flawed, magnificent creatures who laughed and fought and loved and schemed. They had families and feuds. They made mistakes. They suffered consequences. And among them all there was Freyja, whose story we tell tonight. When we think of Norse mythology, certain images spring to mind. Thor with his hammer Mjolnir crashing through the skulls of giants, Odin with his ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, perched on his shoulders as he sits on his high seat, Hlidskjalf, watching all the worlds, Loki with his schemes, his silver tongue weaving chaos wherever he walks. But there's a goddess who stands among them, not behind them, whose power was so vast that even the All-Father sought her wisdom, whose magic made even Odin humble himself as a student. Her name is Freyja, and her story begins long before the world knew her name, in a time when the 9 realms were still young and wild. In the Old Norse tongue, Freyja simply means lady, a title rather than a name, and perhaps that tells us something right there. She was not called by a specific name because she was the essence of what it meant to be a lady, a woman of power, a figure of authority and grace. Think about that for a moment. In a world where names held power, where knowing someone's true name could give you leverage over them, Freyja needed no specific name. She was simply the lady. And that was enough. Everyone knew who you meant when you invoked her. She was born of the Vanir, an ancient tribe of gods who existed alongside the more warlike Aesir, and her origins stretch back to a time when the cosmos was young, and the halls of Asgard had not yet known the complexities of peace and war between divine kindred. The Vanir lived in Vanaheim, one of the 9 realms that clung to the branches of Yggdrasil. While the Aesir built their golden halls and mighty fortresses, the Vanir dwelled closer to the earth, closer to the rhythms of nature. They understood the language of growing things, the patterns of seasons, the ways that life and death wove together in an endless cycle. They were not weaker than the Aesir, merely different in their power. Where the Aesir valued martial strength and hierarchies of command, the Vanir valued wisdom that came from the earth itself, magic that flowed through blood and bone and the turning of the year. Freyja's father was Njord, god of the sea, the wind and wealth. Imagine him, this ancient deity, standing on rocky shores with the spray of the ocean misting his face, commanding the waves and the winds that filled the sails of longships. Njord was not a god of storms, that was a different power entirely. He was the god of the sea's bounty, of successful voyages, of the wealth that came from trade across the water. Fishermen prayed to him, merchants made offerings to him. He was prosperity itself, generous and powerful. Freyja's mother's name has been lost to time, or perhaps deliberately obscured, as was sometimes the way with the most ancient mysteries. Some sources suggest she may have been Nerthus, an earth goddess whose mysteries we can only glimpse through fragments of lore preserved in Roman accounts of Germanic tribes. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote of a goddess the tribes called Nerthus, Mother Earth, who was honored with sacred processions and elaborate rituals. If Nerthus was indeed Freyja's mother, then Freyja was born from the union of sea and earth, wind and soil, the meeting of two primal forces. Freyja had a twin brother, Freyr, whose name means Lord, the perfect counterpart to her lady. Together they represented a divine duality, two faces of the same fertile power, where Freyja brought sunshine that warmed the fields, gentle rains that made crops grow tall, and the prosperity of good harvests. Freyja brought passion, the fire of desire that drives all living things to create new life. Where Freyja was peace and plenty, Freyja was the fierce joy of existence, the ecstasy of being alive. They were two halves of the same whole, children of nature and abundance, and their power was undeniable. The Vikings understood this. They knew that fertility was not just about crops and livestock. It was about the continuation of life in all its forms. It was about the drive to create, to build, to bring forth something new into the world. And Freyja and Freyr together embodied that creative force. But the world of the gods was not always peaceful, and Freyja's story cannot be told without understanding the great conflict that brought her from Vanaheim to the halls of Asgard. To understand the war between the Aesir and Vanir, we must first understand how different these two tribes of gods truly were. Long ago, when the realms were still finding their shape, when the walls of Asgard were newly built and the halls echoed with the footsteps of young gods, there were two tribes of deities who ruled different aspects of the cosmos. The Aesir, who lived in golden Asgard high above Midgard, were gods of war, order, and law. They valued strength of arms, honor in battle, and the hierarchies of leadership that came from martial prowess. Odin ruled them, the All-Father, who had sacrificed his eye for wisdom, and hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights to learn the secrets of the runes. Thor protected them, the thunder god, whose mighty hammer Mjolnir was the ultimate weapon against the giants who threatened the ordered world. Tyr embodied their sense of justice, the one-handed god who had sacrificed his sword hand to bind the great wolf Fenrir, choosing the safety of the cosmos over his own wholeness. The Aesir were builders of civilization, creators of laws, defenders of what they saw as right and proper. But in another realm called Vanaheim lived the Vanir, and they were different in every conceivable way. The Vanir were gods of fertility, of magic, of the wild and untamed forces of nature that could not be controlled by sword or law. They did not rule by force of arms alone, but by seidr, a form of magic so powerful it could see the threads of fate itself and, in the right hands, alter them. The Vanir understood things the Aesir did not. They knew the language of the earth, the way a seed knows when to split open and send forth a green shoot. They knew the secrets of harvest and plenty, the precise balance of sun and rain and soil that makes crops thrive. They knew the ways to coax life from soil and sea, to whisper to animals and have them answer, to read the patterns of the stars and understand what they foretold. And perhaps most unsettling to the martial Aesir, they practiced magic that bent reality to their will. Magic that the Aesir saw as unnatural, as contrary to the proper order of things. The Vanir's magic was not like the rune magic that Odin practiced, which was more structured, more rule-based, more about knowing the right words and symbols to invoke specific effects. Seidr was fluid, intuitive, shamanic. It involved trance states and spirit journeys. It required a practitioner to surrender control, to open themselves to forces beyond mortal or even divine comprehension. It was, in the eyes of the Aesir, dangerously uncontrolled, and it was primarily, though not exclusively, women's magic. This is important. In the Viking world, gender roles were clearly defined. Men were warriors, protectors, rulers. Women were the keepers of the hearth, the weavers, the ones who spun thread and wove cloth and maintained the home. But within that domestic sphere, women held a different kind of power. They were the ones who knew herbs and healing. They were the ones who could see beyond the veil between worlds. And in the Vanir tradition, this feminine power was not subordinate but supreme. For a time, these two tribes coexisted, each in their own realm, each with their own ways. The Aesir built their shining halls and made their plans of conquest. The Vanir tended their fields and wove their spells. There was no particular friendship between them, but neither was there open hostility. They were simply different branches of divinity, each with their own sphere of influence. But then something happened that would shatter this uneasy coexistence and plunge the cosmos into its first great war. A figure appeared in Asgard, a woman of the Vanir, though the sources call her by different names. Some say she was Gulveig, which means gold greed, or power of gold, a name that suggests she was obsessed with wealth, or perhaps that she represented the intoxicating allure of riches. Others say she was seidr, meaning bright one, or honor, a name that implies radiance and respect. Still others suggest this figure was none other than Freyja herself, traveling among the Aesir in disguise, offering her services as a practitioner of seidr magic, testing the waters to see how the Aesir would respond to Vanir wisdom. Whoever she was, the Aesir found her both fascinating and deeply troubling. She arrived in Asgard offering her magical services, and at first, the Aesir were intrigued. Here was a Volva, a seeress, someone who could perform seidr and reveal hidden things, foresee the future, perhaps even alter fate. The gods of Asgard, always hungry for power and advantage, eagerly sought her services. They asked her to perform divinations. They consulted her about their plans and schemes. They wanted to know what she could tell them, what secrets she could reveal. But gradually, they began to realize something unsettling. This woman, this practitioner of Vanir magic, was changing them. Under her influence, the Aesir found themselves making decisions they wouldn't normally make, prioritizing personal gain over communal honor, putting desire before duty. She could see the future, yes, but she could also manipulate fate. She could whisper possibilities into being. She could make people want things they hadn't wanted before, value things they hadn't valued. And she spoke of desires and wealth in ways that unsettled the honor-bound warriors of Asgard, who prided themselves on their adherence to law and oath and the warrior code. The Aesir began to blame her for their own shortcomings. They called her Gulveig, gold greed, accusing her of infecting them with avarice and selfish desire. They saw her magic not as a gift, but as a corruption, a threat to their way of life. And so, whether out of fear, misunderstanding, or sheer arrogance, whether they truly believed she was corrupting them or simply couldn't bear to admit their own weaknesses, they decided to destroy her. They tried to murder her, to eliminate this disturbing Vanir presence from their midst. The Aesir seized this mysterious figure, this woman who had brought Vanir magic into their halls, and they showed her what Aesir justice looked like. Warriors grabbed her arms, held her fast. They pierced her with spears, those sacred weapons that were Odin's symbol, weapons that had been used to seal oaths and mark sacrifices. Blood ran from her wounds, but she did not cry out, did not beg for mercy. They dragged her to the center of Odin's great hall, where the fire burned day and night, and they threw her into the flames. Imagine the scene. The greatest hall in all of Asgard, its roof held up by mighty pillars, its walls hung with shields and weapons, its benches filled with gods and goddesses watching this execution. The fire roared, fed by logs of sacred ash and oak, flames leaping high enough to lick the rafters. Her flesh consumed by fire, her hair burning away, her body reduced to ash and charred bone. The smell of burning flesh filled the hall. The gods watched, satisfied. They had eliminated the threat, purged the corruption from their midst, shown the Vanir what happened to those who tried to infiltrate Asgard with their troubling magic. But then, impossibly, the flames died down. The smoke cleared, and from the ashes stepped the woman whole and unharmed. Her skin was perfect, unmarked by fire. Her eyes, bright and knowing, fixed on the assembled gods with an expression that might have been pity, might have been contempt, might have been something else entirely. She said nothing. She simply stood there, alive, reborn from the flames like a phoenix, proof that the Vanir's power could not be extinguished by force. The Aesir, shocked and frightened, seized her again. Perhaps they thought they hadn't done it right the first time. Perhaps they thought if they burned her hotter, longer, she would stay dead. Once more they stabbed her with spears. Once more they cast her into the fire. Once more she burned, her body consumed, her screams, if she made any, lost in the roar of the flames, and once more, when the fire died, she stepped forth whole and alive. A third time they tried. By now desperation had replaced confidence. 3 was a number of power in Norse belief, a number that completed things, that sealed fates. 3 times should be enough to kill anything, even a Vanir sorceress. They were not gentle this third time. They made sure she was truly thoroughly dead before they threw her into the flames. They watched as the fire took her, as her body blackened and cracked and fell apart. They kept the fire burning long after there was nothing left to burn, until only the finest ash remained. And then they waited. The hall was silent. The gods held their breath. But from the ashes, impossibly, she rose. 3 times burned, 3 times born. Death had no claim on her. The Vanir's magic was not something that could be extinguished by violence. It was something deeper, something that existed beyond the power of the Aesir to control or eliminate. The message was clear, though the Aesir were perhaps too proud to understand it immediately. The Vanir were not inferior to the Aesir. Their magic was not a trick or a weakness. It was a fundamental force of the cosmos, as essential as thunder or the edge of a blade. You could not destroy it. You could only reckon with it, accept it, or make war against it. And the Vanir, when they learned of this insult, this attempted murder of one of their own, this desecration carried out in Odin's hall before all the assembled gods of Asgard, were furious. The news traveled fast in those days, carried by ravens and whispers and the wind itself. In Vanaheim, Njord heard what had been done. Freyja heard. Freyja heard. And they gathered their strength, summoned their kin, wielded their sorceries, and declared war on the Aesir. The war between the Aesir and Vanir was unlike any conflict the cosmos had seen. It was not a war fought merely with swords and spears and arrows, though those things played their part. It was a war between 2 fundamentally different ways of understanding power, 2 different visions of how the divine should function. The Aesir fought with weapons, with strength, with the thunderous might of Thor's hammer crashing through enemy lines, and the tactical genius of Odin's strategies. The Allfather, who could see patterns of battle the way a weaver sees the pattern in cloth. They raised armies, they formed shield walls, they charged across battlefields with the kind of disciplined ferocity that only warriors trained from birth could muster. When Thor entered the fray, giants fell before him like wheat before a scythe. When Tyr led a charge, his single hand gripping his sword, men followed him into death itself because his honor demanded it. But the Vanir fought with magic. They wove spells that turned the tide of battle in ways the Aesir could barely comprehend, illusions that made the Aesir attack their own allies, seeing enemies where there were only friends, enchantments that struck at the mind rather than the body, filling warriors with paralyzing fear or overwhelming rage that made them break formation. The Vanir could make the very earth rise up against the Aesir, roots tangling around ankles, ground opening into sudden pits. They could call up storms that were not Thor's storms, wild and uncontrollable, that battered the Aesir forces with hail and lightning. They could whisper words that made weapons turn in their wielders' hands, that made armor feel like it was crushing the warrior inside, that made the bravest champions doubt their courage. The Aesir's great wall around Asgard, built to protect them from giants and enemies, built from stones so massive it had taken the combined strength of gods to place them, crumbled under the magical assault of the Vanir. Not all at once, but bit by bit, stones cracking, mortar turning to dust, the supposedly impregnable fortifications proving no match for Vanir sorcery. The Aesir watched in horror as their defenses, which they had thought unbreakable, fell apart. It was a profound psychological blow. If the walls could fall, what else could the Vanir unmake? And yet, for all their magic, the Vanir could not decisively defeat the warrior gods. The Aesir adapted, learned to recognize illusions, developed countermeasures. Odin, who had already begun to learn some seidr from the mysterious woman before they burned her, used his own burgeoning magical knowledge to shield his forces from the worst of the Vanir spells. Thor's hammer Mjolnir, forged by dwarves and imbued with its own magic, could shatter Vanir enchantments when it struck. The Aesir moved forward, crossing into Vanaheim, and caused similar devastation there. They burned the sacred groves where the Vanir worked their magic. They shattered the stone circles where rituals had been performed since time immemorial. They showed the Vanir that for all their sorcery, they could still bleed and die under an Aesir blade. The war dragged on, neither side gaining a permanent upper hand, both suffering losses they could ill afford. Gods fell on both sides. Heroes perished. The very fabric of the cosmos trembled under the strain of divine conflict. The realms themselves seemed to darken, as if the sun were reluctant to shine on such carnage. Seasons became confused, winter lingering too long, summer scorching fields that should have been green. The mortals in Midgard, who depended on the gods for their prosperity, suffered. Crops failed, disease spread. It seemed as if the war between the gods might tear the whole world apart. Eventually, exhausted and weary, recognizing that neither side could truly win, that they were locked in an eternal stalemate that would only bring ruin to all, the gods called for a truce. Messengers were sent under flags of peace. Representatives from both sides met at the border between their realms, in a neutral space where neither Aesir nor Vanir held sway, and there they discussed terms. What emerged from those negotiations was a peace built on mutual exchange, a tradition among the ancient Norse and other Germanic peoples that recognized the fragility of truce agreements. Words alone could not be trusted. Oaths could be broken. But if you gave hostages high-ranking members of your own family or tribe, people you actually cared about, then you had a reason to keep the peace. Your own kin would suffer if you broke the truce. It was a cold calculation, perhaps, but an effective one. To ensure that both sides honored the ceasefire, they would trade hostages. High-ranking members of each tribe would go to live among the other, serving as both ambassadors and insurance against renewed conflict. From the Vanir came 3 figures, and they were not chosen randomly. These were the leaders, the most important members of the Vanir pantheon. First, Njord, the sea god, wise and wealthy, whose command over wind and wave made him one of the most powerful Vanir. Losing him would be a devastating blow to Vanaheim. Second, Freyja, Njord's son, the bringer of peace and prosperity, whose very presence made crops grow and animals thrive, whose smile was said to be like sunshine after rain. He was beloved among the Vanir, and his absence would be deeply felt. And third, Freyja, Njord's daughter, the mistress of magic and beauty, the one who perhaps more than any other embodied the spirit of the Vanir. She was their greatest sorceress, their most powerful practitioner of seidr. Sending her to Asgard was a risk, but also a gift, an offering of the Vanir's most precious knowledge. Picture the scene as these 3 prepared to leave Vanaheim. Njord standing tall and proud, his cloak smelling of salt spray and distant shores, saying his farewells to the realm he had helped to govern. Freyja, looking back at the fields and forests he had tended, wondering if Asgard had any place as beautiful as the green meadows of his homeland. And Freyja, her golden hair bound for travel, her eyes already looking toward the future, toward what she might accomplish in Asgard. She was not going as a prisoner exactly. She was going as a hostage, yes, but also as a teacher, as someone who carried the wisdom of the Vanir to the Aesir. Perhaps she knew even then that she would change them more than they would change her. These 3 traveled to Asgard to live among the Aesir, crossing from Vanaheim through the worlds, perhaps along the Rainbow Bridge Bifrost that connected the realms, though some sources suggest they took other paths. When they arrived in Asgard, they were received with caution and curiosity. The Aesir had just spent years trying to destroy the Vanir, and now they were expected to welcome them as honored guests. It must have been an awkward adjustment on both sides. The Aesir watching these Vanir gods, wondering if they could be trusted, wondering if one day they would wake to find Vanir magic turned against them again. The Vanir watching the Aesir, living among those who had burned their sister, who had torn down their sacred places, trying to find a way to coexist with warriors whose idea of honor seemed so foreign. In exchange, the Aesir sent 2 of their own to dwell in Vanaheim. Honir, a god associated with decision-making, with the ability to choose wisely when presented with options. He was tall and handsome, well-spoken when he chose to speak, the kind of god who could represent the Aesir with dignity. And Mimir, the wisest of all beings, advisor to Odin himself, whose knowledge was legendary even among the gods. Mimir had drunk from the well of wisdom that lay beneath one of Yggdrasil's roots. He knew things that even Odin did not. He was Odin's most trusted counselor, and sending him away was a real sacrifice, proof that the Aesir were serious about the peace. At first things seemed to go well in Asgard. Njord and his children were received with honor, given halls to dwell in, invited to the councils of the gods. Odin, ever the politician, made a show of respect for the Vanir, acknowledging their power and their importance. He appointed Njord and Freyja as priests over ritual sacrifices, a role of tremendous spiritual importance in Norse religion. This was not a minor position. The priests were the ones who mediated between gods and mortals, who performed the sacred rites that kept the cosmos in balance. By giving this role to the Vanir, Odin was acknowledging their deep connection to the cycles of nature and fertility, their understanding of the sacred mysteries that the Aesir, for all their warrior prowess, did not fully grasp. But it was Freyja who truly captured the attention of the Aesir, and whose presence would have the most profound impact on Asgard. She was appointed priestess of the sacrifices, working alongside her father and brother in the performance of sacred rites. But more than that, she became a teacher, and her subject was the very thing that had started the war in the first place: seidr. That art of magic which the Aesir had feared, which they had tried to stamp out, which had proven so devastatingly effective against them in battle. Now in the peace that followed the war, Freyja offered to teach it to them. It's hard to overstate how significant this was. The Aesir had lost people in the war. They had seen their defenses crumble. They had faced an enemy whose power they didn't understand. And now that enemy, in the form of a beautiful, terrifying goddess, was offering to show them how that power worked. This art of magic, which had been the exclusive province of the Vanir, was now shared with the warrior gods of Asgard. And Freyja was the one who opened that door. Imagine her, standing before the assembled gods in one of Asgard's great halls, the firelight flickering across her face, explaining the mysteries of seidr to an audience that was both fascinated and frightened. She would have to start with the basics, because the Aesir's understanding of magic was so different from the Vanir way. Seidr, she would explain, comes from a word meaning cord or string or snare. It is the magic of weaving, not just literal weaving of thread into cloth, though that is part of it, but the metaphorical weaving of fate itself. The Norns, those three powerful beings who sit at the base of Yggdrasil, spin and measure and cut the threads of every life. What is born will live its allotted span and then die. What is fated will come to pass. This is the way of things. But seidr practitioners, Freyja would say, can see those threads. They can perceive the pattern before it's fully woven, and in some cases, with the right knowledge and the right sacrifice, they can add a new thread to the weave, altering what was supposed to happen, creating a new possibility. To practice seidr requires entering a trance state, a condition where the boundaries between this world and the spirit world dissolve. The practitioner sits often on a high seat, a raised platform that elevates them above the ordinary realm. They hold a staff, the seidstafr, a tool carved with runes and sacred symbols. Sometimes this staff is described as a distaff, the tool used in spinning, which makes sense given seidr's connection to weaving and thread. The staff is not just a prop. It's a focus, a channel for the practitioner's will, a way to direct the magic that flows through them. Around the practitioner, others may chant or sing, helping to induce the trance. There are references in the sagas to specific songs used for seidr, called vardlukur, which means something like guardian songs or ward songs. These songs would be sung by assistants, while the vulva, the seeress, entered her trance state. The sound would build, rhythmic and hypnotic, pulling the practitioner deeper into the altered state of consciousness necessary for the magic to work. In this trance, the practitioner's spirit leaves their body, travels through the 9 realms, encounters spirits and deities, gains knowledge that cannot be accessed in ordinary waking consciousness. What they see in these journeys can vary. Sometimes they see the future, events that have not yet come to pass but which are already woven into the pattern of fate. A battle that will be lost, a child who will be born, a betrayal that will shatter a friendship. The vision might be clear and specific, or it might be symbolic, requiring interpretation. A crow landing on a shield might mean death in battle. A blooming tree might mean a successful harvest. The seeress must understand the language of symbols, the way dreams speak in images rather than words. But seidr is not only about seeing the future, it can also be used to affect the present. A skilled practitioner can work magic to bring about specific results. Healing the sick, though this was a delicate art, as illness might be caused by spirits or curses that had to be addressed before the body could mend. Ensuring a good harvest, by working magic to encourage the rain and sun, by blessing the fields, by calling on the spirits of the land to be generous, calling game animals during a hunt, making deer and elk come within range of the hunter's arrows, controlling the weather, though this was dangerous, as weather magic could easily spiral out of control, bringing storms that destroyed rather than nourished. And then there were the darker applications of seidr, cursing enemies, sending nightmares or illness or misfortune to those who had wronged you, binding someone's will, making them do what you wanted, though this was considered deeply unethical by most practitioners, causing strife and discord, whispering possibilities that turned friends into enemies, planting seeds of doubt and suspicion. The line between using seidr for good and using it for harm was not always clear, and it depended entirely on the ethics and intentions of the practitioner. Freyja, teaching the Aesir, would have emphasized both the power and the responsibility that came with seidr. This was not magic you used lightly. Every alteration of fate had consequences, ripples that spread out through the pattern of what was and what would be. Change one thread and you might unravel a dozen others. Save one life and you might inadvertently cause 3 deaths. Seidr practitioners had to be willing to bear that weight, to accept that their actions would shape the future in ways they might not be able to predict or control. Odin, ever hungry for knowledge and power, was the first to learn. He spent long hours studying under Freyja, absorbing the techniques of trance, prophecy, and fate-weaving. He sat on the high seat. He held the staff. He learned the songs that would help him enter the trance state. He journeyed into the spirit world, his ravens Hugin and Munin perhaps guiding him, showing him paths between the realms. He learned to see the threads of fate, to perceive the patterns that shaped all things. And gradually, painfully, he learned to manipulate those threads to add his will to the weave. But there was a problem, one that would haunt Odin for the rest of his existence. Among the Vikings, among the Norse people who worshipped these gods, seidr was considered women's magic. It involved spinning, weaving, the manipulation of threads, all activities that fell squarely within the female sphere of work and influence. For a man to practice seidr was to adopt a feminine role, to take on the characteristics and activities of women, and in the rigid gender constructs of Norse society, this was seen as deeply, profoundly shameful. The word used for a man who practiced seidr was arger, meaning unmanly or effeminate. The noun form ergi meant unmanliness, and it was one of the worst insults that could be leveled at a Norse man. To call someone arger was to say that they had violated the fundamental nature of what it meant to be a man. It was grounds for a duel, for blood feud, for violence. A man accused of being arger had to respond with lethal force or be forever dishonored. This was not about homosexuality exactly, though that could be part of it. It was about gender roles, about the belief that men and women had distinct natures and responsibilities, and that crossing those boundaries was a violation of cosmic order. So when Odin learned seidr, when he sat on the high seat holding the distaff, when he entered trances and wove spells and manipulated fate in ways that were supposed to be the province of women, he was doing something that, by the standards of his culture, made him arger. And people, even other gods, noticed. In one of the surviving poems, the Lokasena, where Loki accuses nearly every god and goddess present of various misdeeds, he specifically mocks Odin for practicing seidr. He calls it unmanly, accuses Odin of adopting feminine ways, throws the charge of ergi in the All-Father's face. Odin's response is sharp and defensive, essentially saying that yes, he practiced what some might consider women's magic, but he did it because the power was worth it, because knowledge was more important than social convention. But Odin didn't care about the social cost, or at least he cared about it less than he cared about power. Power to him was worth any price, even social prestige, even the respect of his peers. He had already sacrificed one of his eyes, plucking it from his own head and dropping it into Mimir's well to gain a drink of the water of wisdom. He had already hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights, pierced by his own spear, sacrificing himself to himself in a shamanic ordeal to learn the secrets of the runes. Compared to those sacrifices, the whispers about his unmanliness must have seemed like a small price to pay. And so he learned. He mastered seidr, becoming one of its greatest practitioners, second only to Freyja herself. Yet even he, the All-Father, the King of the Gods, could not escape the taint of practicing what was considered women's magic. The accusation stuck, a reminder that even divine power could not fully transcend the social norms of the culture that created these gods. This was the price of the knowledge Freyja brought to Asgard. Power, yes, but also shame. The ability to see and shape fate, but also the burden of being seen as unmanly for wielding that ability. The Aesir now had access to seidr, to the magic that had made the Vanir so formidable in the war. But they would forever struggle with what it meant for their identity as warrior gods to practice what was essentially a domestic, feminine art. Freyja had brought them a gift, but like all powerful gifts in Norse mythology, it came with a cost. She had changed the Aesir forever, given them knowledge they could not unlearn, power they could not give back. And in doing so, she had secured her place in Asgard not as a hostage or a prisoner, but as a teacher, a goddess whose wisdom was so valuable that even the proud Aesir had to humble themselves to receive it. Meanwhile, back in Vanaheim, things were not going as smoothly. Honir and Mimir had arrived among the Vanir, but the Vanir quickly realized something was off. Honir seemed capable of delivering wise counsel on any matter, impressing them with his insight and judgment, but they soon noticed that Honir only offered such wisdom when Mimir was at his side, whispering advice. When Mimir was absent, Honir became indecisive and useless. The Vanir felt cheated. They believed the Aesir had sent them a fraud, a figurehead with no real ability, while they had given up their greatest treasures, Njord, Freyja, and Freyja. In their anger, the Vanir took drastic action. They beheaded Mimir and sent his severed head back to Asgard. When Odin received the head of his beloved advisor, he could have renewed the war, but he didn't. Instead, he used magic to preserve Mimir's head, anointing it with herbs and speaking spells over it until the head could speak once more, offering counsel from beyond death. It was a grim solution, but it worked, and rather than let this tragedy reignite the conflict, the Aesir and Vanir came together once more. They performed a ritual to seal their peace. Each god, Aesir and Vanir alike, spat into a great cauldron. From the mingled saliva of all the gods, a new being was created, Kvasir, the wisest of all creatures, who embodied the unity and harmony between the two tribes. The war was over. The Aesir and Vanir were now one pantheon, and Freyja had found a new home in Asgard, but her story was only beginning. Freyja's most immediate and recognizable domain was love. Not the gentle, chaste affection of greeting cards and romantic comedies, but love in all its forms. Passionate love, erotic love, the kind of love that drives people to obsession, to recklessness, to acts both beautiful and terrible. She was a goddess of desire, of sexuality, of the raw attraction that pulls bodies together and hearts apart. In the Viking world, Freyja was invoked by those seeking a partner, those hoping for a fruitful marriage, those wishing for rekindled passion. She understood the complexities of love better than any other deity, because she herself had known its heights and depths. She was described as the most beautiful of all the goddesses, a figure of such radiance that even the coldest heart could not help but warm in her presence. Her beauty was not merely physical, though the sources make clear she was stunning to behold. It was an otherworldly magnetism, an aura of desirability that made her the most sought-after goddess in the Norse cosmos. Giants offered kingdoms for her hand, dwarves crafted treasures to win her favor, gods vied for her attention. And Freyja, for her part, was no passive object of affection. She chose her own path, her own lovers, her own destiny. The Vikings did not see her sexuality as a moral failing. It was rather a source of her power. In a world where fertility meant survival, where the continuation of life depended on successful harvests, healthy livestock, and thriving children, a goddess who embodied the procreative force of the universe was essential. Freyja was not bound by the same restrictions as mortal women, and the myths reflect this. She had many lovers, both gods and mortals, and she made no apologies for it. In one poem, Loki accuses her of having slept with every god and elf in Asgard, including her own brother. Whether this accusation was true or merely Loki's attempt to shame her is unclear, but what matters is that Freyja does not deny it. She fires back at Loki with equal venom, accusing him of his own transgressions. She is not cowed by his words. She does not beg forgiveness or hang her head in shame. She stands her ground, a goddess who refuses to be diminished. But Freyja was more than just a goddess of passion and pleasure. She was also deeply connected to fertility, to the abundance of the earth, to the cycles of life that sustained the Viking people. One of her alternate names, Horn, likely derives from an Old Norse word meaning flax or linen. This might seem mundane, but flax was an incredibly important crop in ancient Scandinavia. It was used to make linen, which in turn was used for clothing, sails, and most importantly, bridal dresses. Flax was believed to have protective properties, warding off evil and bringing fertility to those who worked with it. And because the cultivation and processing of flax was traditionally women's work, involving spinning and weaving, it connected Freyja directly to the domestic sphere, to the creation of life and home. In this way, she became a protector of marriages, a guardian of the sacred bonds between husband and wife, even as she herself embodied a more liberated approach to love and sexuality. Another of her names, Gefn, means the giver, reinforcing her role as a goddess of abundance and generosity. She was not a hoarder of blessings, but one who bestowed them freely on those who honored her. Farmers prayed to her for good harvests. Women invoked her during childbirth, hoping for her blessing of safe delivery. Couples sought her favor on their wedding day, asking for passion, fertility, and lasting joy. Freyja's presence in Viking life was not confined to grand myths and epic tales. She was woven into the fabric of everyday existence, a constant companion through the cycles of planting and reaping, birth and death, love and loss. And perhaps nowhere is this more evident than in the simple fact that one day of the week still bears her name. Friday in English comes from the Old English frigadag, meaning Frigg's Day, but in Scandinavian languages it's more explicitly Freyja's Day, Fredag in Swedish, Norwegian and Danish, Freitag in German, though the German derives from the Proto-Germanic goddess who may have been the common ancestor of both Freyja and Frigg. Every week when Friday arrives, we're unknowingly honoring a goddess whose name meant lady, whose power shaped the lives of countless people, and whose legacy endures in ways we rarely stop to consider. But love and fertility were only part of Freyja's story. To understand her fully, we must turn to the aspect of her nature that set her apart from nearly every other goddess in the Norse pantheon. Freyja was a mistress of magic, a sorceress of unparalleled skill, the teacher of the gods themselves in the art of seidr. And to understand what that meant, we need to understand what seidr was. Seidr was not your typical magic. It wasn't about fireballs or transforming enemies into frogs. It was subtler, stranger, and far more powerful. Seidr was the magic of fate itself. It involved entering trance states, journeying into the spirit world, and perceiving the threads that wove together the destinies of gods and mortals alike. More than that, seidr practitioners, those skilled enough, could manipulate those threads. They could see what was coming and in some cases change it. They could bless or curse. They could heal or harm. They could bring good fortune or disaster. And they could do all of this, not through brute force, but through the careful, deliberate weaving of magical intention. The practice of seidr was closely associated with spinning and weaving, both literal and metaphorical. Practitioners often carried a staff called a seidstafr, sometimes translated as a distaff, the tool used in spinning thread. This was not coincidental. In Norse cosmology, fate itself was envisioned as threads spun, measured, and cut by the Norns, three powerful beings who sat at the base of Yggdrasil, the world tree, and determined the destiny of every living thing. To practice seidr was to engage with those same threads, to touch the fabric of reality and reshape it according to one's will. It was, in every sense, women's work elevated to cosmic significance. The Vanir were the originators of this art, and Freyja was its greatest living practitioner. When she came to Asgard as part of the peace agreement, she brought seidr with her, and she taught it to the Aesir. But the transmission of this knowledge was not without complications. As mentioned earlier, seidr was deeply gendered. It was considered appropriate, even powerful, for women to practice it. Women who mastered seidr were known as volvas, seers, or prophetesses, who traveled from town to town offering their services. They were respected, feared, and sought after. They wore distinctive clothing, carried their staffs, and entered trances to commune with spirits and glimpse the future. They were essential figures in Viking society, consulted before battles, during famines, when illness struck, whenever people needed to know what fate had in store. But for men, the situation was different. A man who practiced seidr was seen as taking on a feminine role, and in the rigid gender norms of Viking culture, this was shameful. The accusation of being argur was serious. It implied not just effeminacy, but a deeper violation of the social order, a man who had abandoned his proper role as warrior and protector. Yet, despite this stigma, some men did practice seidr, and the most famous of these was Odin himself. Odin, the All-Father, the god of war, poetry, and wisdom, was willing to endure the shame of practicing seidr because he valued knowledge above all else. He was a god obsessed with gathering information, with learning secrets, with acquiring power that others did not possess. He had already sacrificed one of his eyes to drink from the well of wisdom. He had hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights to learn the secrets of the runes. And now, under Freyja's tutelage, he mastered seidr, becoming one of the few male gods to wield this art. The relationship between Odin and Freyja is one of the most intriguing dynamics in Norse mythology. They were, in many ways, counterparts. Both were associated with magic and wisdom. Both had connections to death and the afterlife. Both were willing to bend rules and cross boundaries to achieve their ends. Some scholars have even suggested that Odin and Freyja's husband, Odr, were originally the same figure, that the myths preserved a memory of a time when these two deities were more closely linked, perhaps even aspects of the same divine power. But in the myths as we have them, Odin and Freyja are distinct, and their relationship is complex. Odin learned from Freyja, which placed him in a subordinate position, at least temporarily. He respected her knowledge, sought her counsel, and recognized her as a powerful force in the cosmos. And yet there are tensions. In one saga, Odin sends Loki to steal Freyja's most precious possession, the necklace Brísingamen, an act we'll explore in depth soon. Why would he do this? Jealousy, a test, a need to control her power. The sources don't give a clear answer, but it hints at a complicated dynamic between these two mighty beings. Freyja's magic was not limited to seidr, though that was her primary art. She was also a shapeshifter, able to take on different forms to suit her needs. One of her most famous possessions was a cloak made of falcon feathers, which allowed her to transform into a bird and fly across the 9 realms. This cloak is mentioned in several myths, sometimes used by Freyja herself, sometimes lent to other gods, most notably Loki, who borrowed it on at least 2 occasions to travel to the land of the giants. The ability to fly, to move between worlds, to see from above, all of this fit perfectly with Freyja's role as a practitioner of magic. She was not bound by the limitations of ordinary beings. She could transcend boundaries, physical and otherwise, and her falcon cloak was a symbol of that freedom. But perhaps the most telling detail about Freyja's magical prowess is this. Despite being famous for her connection to seidr, despite teaching it to the gods, Freyja herself is never described in the surviving sources as delivering prophecies. That role often goes to other figures, other seers, other volvas. Freyja was the teacher, the master, but she did not always play the role of oracle. Instead, she was the one who understood the mechanisms of magic, who could work the threads of fate, who held the power but chose when and how to use it. She was, in essence, the architect of destiny, not merely its reader. And then there's the matter of her students, the Volvas of Midgard, the mortal world. According to legend, these women learned their craft from Freyja, either directly or through a lineage of teaching that traced back to her. The Volvas were powerful figures in Viking society, treated with a mix of reverence and unease. They performed rituals, entered trances, spoke with the dead, and foresaw events yet to come. One of the most detailed descriptions of a Volva comes from the saga of Eric the Red, set in Greenland. The saga describes a woman named Thorbjorg, known as the Little Volva, who arrives at a settlement during a time of hardship. She is dressed in a blue cloak, a headdress of black lamb trimmed with white ermine, and she carries a staff topped with brass and studded with stones. She sits on a high seat, a cushion stuffed with hen feathers beneath her, and she performs a ritual to divine the future. The people of the settlement treat her with great respect, preparing special foods for her, asking for her wisdom. This was the legacy of Freyja's magic. Women who walked in her footsteps, wielding power that could shape the fate of communities. And even after Christianity swept through Scandinavia, even after the old gods were officially abandoned, the memory of these women persisted. Folk traditions carried echoes of seidr, and Freyja's name lingered in whispers, in plant names, in stories told by firelight. The church might have renamed her a demon or a witch, but they could not erase her entirely. She had woven herself too deeply into the fabric of the culture. Now, if you've been paying attention, you might have noticed something. We've talked about Freyja as a goddess of love and a mistress of magic, but we haven't yet addressed one of her most surprising, most powerful roles. Freyja was a goddess of war. Not in the way Thor was a warrior god, swinging his hammer and crushing giants, not in the way Tyr embodied martial honor and justice. Freyja's connection to war was different, more unsettling, more profound. She was a chooser of the slain. In Norse belief, those who died in battle did not simply perish. If they died bravely, with weapons in hand, their souls were selected by divine beings and taken to one of two afterlife destinations. Everyone knows about Valhalla, Odin's great hall, where warriors feast and fight and prepare for the final battle of Ragnarok. But what many people don't know is that Valhalla was not the only warrior's paradise. There was another place, another hall, ruled by Freyja, and it was called Folkvangr. Folkvangr means field of the host, or field of the people, and it was Freyja's domain, her realm within Asgard where she received the souls of fallen warriors. The sources are explicit. Freyja chose half of the slain, and Odin took the other half. Half. Not the leftovers, not the second-rate warriors, not those Odin didn't want, but an equal share, selected by Freyja herself. This means that Freyja had the same authority as the All-Father when it came to claiming the honored dead. It means she rode onto battlefields, or perhaps flew in her falcon form, and decided which souls would come with her. And here's the truly fascinating part. Some sources suggest that Freyja chose first, before Odin's Valkyries made their selections. If this is true, and not all scholars agree, it means Freyja had first pick, the primary right to choose among the fallen. Odin, for all his power and prestige, received what remained after Freyja had made her choice. Within Folkvangr was Freyja's hall, called Sessrumnir, which translates to seat room or room of many seats. The name suggests a large, welcoming space, a place where the souls of warriors could gather, feast, and find rest. Some descriptions compare it to Valhalla, suggesting that Sessrumnir functioned much the same way, as a place of honor and camaraderie for the slain, but the sources are frustratingly vague about what actually happened in Folkvangr. Did the warriors train for Ragnarok as they did in Valhalla? Did they feast on boar and drink mead from the horns of plenty? The myths don't tell us. What we do know is that Freyja presided over this realm, that she welcomed the souls of the brave, and that her role in the afterlife was just as important as Odin's. Some scholars have speculated about why there were two warrior paradises in Norse belief. One theory is that it reflects different types of warriors or different forms of initiation. Perhaps those devoted to Odin went to Valhalla, while those with a connection to the Vanir or to Freyja's particular brand of power went to Folkvangr. Another theory suggests that Folkvangr was not exclusively for warriors, but also open to others who died honorable deaths. There's a passage in one saga where a woman declares that she will refuse to eat and starve herself so that she can join Freyja, suggesting that Folkvangr might have been accessible to women who died with dignity. even if they never held a sword. The connection between Freyja and the Valkyries is another layer of complexity. The Valkyries, the choosers of the slain, were female warrior spirits who served Odin, riding through the skies on their horses, descending onto battlefields to select the worthy dead. But Freyja, as we've seen, also chose the slain. Some scholars believe that Freyja was the original prototype for the Valkyries, that she was the first chooser of the slain, and that the Valkyries as a group were modeled on her. Others suggest that Freyja may have been the leader of the Valkyries, commanding them even as they served Odin. The evidence is ambiguous, but the link is there. Freyja was intimately connected to death in battle, to the selection of souls, to the transition from life to the afterlife. She was, in every sense, a goddess of war, even if she didn't fight the way male war gods did. Her power on the battlefield was not in swinging a sword, but in determining who would be remembered, who would be honored, who would be taken to feast among the gods forever, and that in many ways was a greater power than any weapon. There's a poetic name for Freyja that appears in some of the old sources. Valfreyja, the Lady of the Slain. It's a perfect encapsulation of her role. She was the lady, the ruler, the one who presided over the fallen, and her authority in this realm was absolute. No one questioned her right to choose. No one challenged her claim to half the honored dead. She was Valfreyja, and the warriors who fell in battle knew that their fate might be to join her in Folkvanger, to feast in her hall, to spend eternity under her watchful, powerful gaze. So when you think of Freyja, don't just think of the goddess of love and beauty. Think also of the goddess who walks among the dying, who reaches out her hand to the warrior taking his last breath, who says, "You have been chosen. Come with me." Think of her as a goddess who understands that love and death are not opposites but intertwined, that both require courage, that both involve a kind of surrender. Freyja knew this better than anyone because she had experienced both in their fullest, most overwhelming forms. Now we come to one of the most famous, most debated, most symbolically rich stories in all of Freyja's mythology. The tale of Brísingamen, her necklace, a piece of jewelry so beautiful, so powerful, so deeply connected to her identity that it became one of her most recognizable attributes. The story of how she acquired it is one that has been told and retold, interpreted and reinterpreted, sometimes celebrated, sometimes criticized, but always remembered. It goes like this. One day, Freyja was wandering through the wild places between the realms, perhaps in the forests of Midgard or the rocky borders of Svartalfheim, the realm of the dwarves. She came upon a cave, or perhaps a forge, where 4 dwarven smiths were at work. Their names were Alfrig, Berling, Dvalin and Greer, master craftsmen whose skill was legendary even among their kind, and there, on an anvil or a workbench, glittering in the firelight, was the most exquisite necklace Freyja had ever seen. It was made of gold or perhaps amber, or perhaps both, depending on the version of the story you follow. Some sources describe it as a torque, a thick band of precious metal, while others envision it as a more delicate chain studded with gems that shone like stars. But whatever its exact form, its beauty was undeniable. The moment Freyja laid eyes on it, she knew she had to have it. She approached the dwarves and asked them to name their price. Gold, she offered, silver, any amount of treasure they desired. But the dwarves refused. They shook their heads and said that no amount of wealth could buy Brísingamen from them. They had poured their skill, their craft, their very essence into its creation, and it was beyond price. Freyja pressed them. What then would they accept in exchange? The dwarves looked at each other, and then they named their terms. The only payment they would accept was Freyja herself. She must spend 1 night with each of them, 4 nights in total, and only then would Brísingamen be hers. Now this is where the story becomes controversial. By the standards of many modern readers, this is a deeply uncomfortable bargain. The dwarves are essentially demanding sex in exchange for the necklace, and Freyja, desiring the necklace so intensely, agrees. Some interpret this as a story of coercion, of Freyja being forced into an unfair transaction. Others see it as evidence of her agency, her willingness to use her sexuality as she saw fit to achieve her goals. Still others view it as symbolic, not meant to be taken literally but as a metaphor for the sacrifices required to attain beauty, power, or knowledge. What's clear from the sources is that Freyja agreed. She spent one night with each of the four dwarves, Alfrig, Berling, Dvalin and Grer, and on the fifth morning, Brísingamen was hers. She placed it around her neck, and from that moment on, it became inseparable from her identity. The necklace glowed with an otherworldly light, enhancing her beauty, amplifying her presence, marking her as the goddess she was. Some versions of the myth suggest that Brísingamen had magical properties beyond its beauty. It may have been connected to seidr, to Freyja's powers of enchantment and fate-weaving. It may have served as a symbol of her dominion over love and desire. Or it may have simply been the most beautiful object in the cosmos, a treasure worthy of a goddess. But the story doesn't end there. Loki, the trickster god, had followed Freyja to the dwarven forge, watching from the shadows as she made her bargain. Always one to stir up trouble, Loki reported what he had seen to Odin. And Odin, for reasons that remain unclear, decided that Freyja's acquisition of Brísingamen was unacceptable. Perhaps he was jealous of her power. Perhaps he saw the necklace as a threat. Perhaps he simply wanted to test her. Whatever his motivation, Odin commanded Loki to steal Brísingamen from Freyja. Loki, being Loki, found a way. He transformed himself into a fly, or in some versions a flea, and snuck into Freyja's bedchamber while she slept. The necklace was clasped around her neck, and she was lying on her back, making it impossible to reach the clasp. So Loki bit her, a sharp sting that caused Freyja to shift in her sleep, rolling onto her side. With the clasp now accessible, Loki carefully undid it, slipped Brísingamen free, and fled. When Freyja woke and discovered the necklace missing, she immediately knew what had happened. She confronted Odin, demanding that he return Brísingamen. But Odin, ever the manipulator, set a price. He would return the necklace only if Freyja performed a specific task. She must cause two kings to fight an eternal battle, a conflict that would rage until the end of days, unless a Christian hero came and broke the curse. This detail, the reference to a Christian hero, is a clear later addition, added by the Christian scribes who wrote down the Norse myths centuries after the Viking Age. But the core of the story remains. Freyja agreed to Odin's terms, worked her magic to set the eternal battle in motion, and Brísingamen was returned to her. In another version of the tale, the one who recovered the necklace was not Odin but Heimdall, the watchman of the gods whose keen eyes could see everything. There was a battle between Loki and Heimdall, both of them transforming into seals and fighting in the sea, and Heimdall ultimately won, retrieving Brísingamen and returning it to Freyja. The different versions of the story suggest that this myth was told and retold in different ways, each community or skald adding their own details, their own spin. But the core remains constant. Freyja wanted the necklace. She paid a price to obtain it. Loki stole it. It was recovered. And Brísingamen became one of her most iconic attributes. So what does Brísingamen represent? On one level, it's simply a beautiful object, a treasure worthy of a goddess. But symbolically, it's much more. The name itself is telling. Brísingamen can be translated as necklace of the Brísings, which might refer to the dwarves who made it, or it can be interpreted as necklace of fire or necklace of amber, linking it to light, to warmth, to the life-giving force of the sun. The necklace sits at Freyja's throat, close to her heart, a physical manifestation of her power and her beauty. It enhances what is already there, amplifying her allure, marking her as someone set apart. Some scholars have suggested that the necklace was connected to fertility, that it symbolized the generative power of the goddess, the ability to bring life into the world. Others link it to seidr, suggesting that Brísingamen was a magical tool, a focus for Freyja's enchantments. Still others see it as a symbol of sovereignty, a mark of her authority as a goddess, a visible sign that she ruled over her domains with undisputed power. And then, there's the question of the transaction itself, the 4 nights with the 4 dwarves. This has been interpreted in countless ways. Some see it as a metaphor for the 4 seasons, Freyja giving herself to each in turn to ensure the fertility of the land. Others view it as a ritual exchange, not sexual in a literal sense, but symbolic, a giving of essence or power. And some modern readers have reclaimed the story, seeing Freyja as a figure of sexual autonomy, a goddess who chose what she wanted and was unapologetic about the price she paid. Whether you see her as empowered or exploited likely says more about your own values and cultural context than about the original myth. What's undeniable is that Brísingamen mattered. It was precious to Freyja, important enough that she was willing to defy social expectations to obtain it, important enough that Odin felt the need to take it from her, important enough that it was always returned. And in the centuries since, Brísingamen has become a symbol in its own right, appearing in art, in literature, in jewelry designed to evoke the goddess's power. It reminds us that beauty, like magic, like love, often requires sacrifice, and that Freyja above all understood the price of desire. But for all her power, for all her beauty, for all her mastery of magic and her authority over the slain, Freyja's story is also one of profound loss, because she had a husband, and he left her. His name was Oda, and his disappearance is one of the most haunting, most tragic elements of Freyja's mythology. We know very little about Oda. The sources are sparse, and what we do have is fragmentary. He is described as Freyja's husband, and together they had 2 daughters, Nos and Gersemi. Both names mean something like treasure or precious thing, and it suggested that they were not just daughters, but perhaps embodiments of Freyja herself, manifestations of her most cherished aspects. But Oda did not stay. For reasons never fully explained, he left Asgard and went wandering across the 9 realms, traveling to distant lands, far from the gods, far from his family. Some sources say he was a god of inspiration, of poetic frenzy, of the wild, restless energy that drives artists and seekers. His name, Oda, is related to words meaning fury, frenzy, or ecstasy, the same root that gives us Odin's name. In fact, many scholars believe that Oda and Odin were originally the same figure, or at least closely related, and that the myths preserve a memory of a time when Freyja and Odin's wife Frigg were also one goddess who later split into 2 distinct figures. But in the myths as we have them, Oda is separate from Odin, and his wandering is its own story. Freyja did not accept his absence quietly. She loved Oda deeply and truly, and when he left she wept. But her tears were not ordinary tears. They were tears of red gold, molten and precious, falling from her eyes and scattering across the earth. Where her tears landed, they solidified into gold, into amber, into treasures that glittered in the soil and along the shores. This image of the goddess weeping tears of gold has become one of the most iconic aspects of Freyja's mythology. It appears in poetry, in art, in the names given to gold itself in the old kennings, the metaphorical phrases used by Norse poets. Gold was called Freyja's tears, or the rain from Freyja's eyes, a poetic acknowledgement that her sorrow was as valuable as the most precious metal. But the tears were not just a symbol. They were a manifestation of her grief, her longing, her refusal to give up. Because Freyja did not simply stay in Asgard and mourn. She went searching for Oda. She traveled through the 9 realms, disguising herself, taking on different names so that she could move unrecognized among strange peoples. The sources list some of these names: Mardol, Horn, Gefen, Seir. Each one a different identity, a different persona she adopted in her quest to find her lost husband. And as she traveled, she wept, and her tears fell as gold, marking her path across the worlds. Did she ever find him? The sources don't give us a clear answer. Some suggest that she did, that they were reunited at least temporarily before he wandered off again. Others imply that she searched in vain, that Oda remained forever out of reach, a figure of longing who could never be fully reclaimed. There's a profound melancholy in this part of Freyja's story. Here is a goddess of immense power, someone who can choose the slain, who can weave fate itself, who commands the respect of gods and giants alike. And yet she cannot bring back the one person she loves most. Her power has limits. Her magic cannot solve every problem. She is, in this way, deeply human, vulnerable in a way that makes her all the more compelling. The myth of Oda's disappearance and Freyja's tears speaks to something universal. The pain of absence, the ache of unfinished love, the way we carry grief with us, even as we continue to move through the world. Freyja's tears falling as gold suggest that even our sorrow has value, that it becomes part of the treasure of our lives, beautiful and terrible at once. And the fact that she kept searching, that she never simply gave up and accepted his loss, speaks to her resilience, her determination, her refusal to be defined solely by what she had lost. There's also a deeper, more esoteric interpretation of the Oda myth. Some scholars have suggested that Oda represents the ecstatic, the transcendent, the part of the divine that cannot be contained or possessed. In this reading, Freyja's search for Oda is not just about a missing husband, but about the human or godly yearning for connection with something beyond ourselves, something that moves just out of reach, no matter how hard we chase it. Oda is the muse, the inspiration, the fleeting moment of clarity that comes and goes without warning. Freyja, in her search, is every artist, every mystic, every lover who has felt the presence of something profound and then watched it slip away. And her tears, her golden tears, are the works of beauty and meaning we create in the wake of that loss. Whether or not the original audience of these myths would have seen it this way, we can't know. But the resonance is there, and it's part of why Freyja's story continues to speak to people today. She is not a distant, untouchable goddess. She is someone who knows what it's like to love and to lose, to search and to grieve. And that makes her real in a way that transcends mythology. Beyond Brísingamen, beyond her tears, Freyja had other symbols and attributes that marked her as unique among the gods. We've already mentioned her falcon feather cloak, which allowed her to shapeshift and fly, a gift that gave her freedom of movement unmatched by almost any other deity. But there were other things, other creatures and objects that were uniquely hers. First, there was her chariot. Unlike the male gods who often rode horses or walked on their own power, Freyja traveled in a chariot pulled by two large cats. Yes, cats, not horses, not wolves, not dragons, but cats. The sources don't specify the breed, but they're described as large, possibly more like lynxes or Norwegian forest cats than the domestic cats we might picture today. Still, the image is striking, a goddess riding through the sky in a chariot drawn by felines, creatures known for their independence, their grace, their refusal to be tamed. It's a perfect fit for Freyja, a goddess who could not be controlled, who moved through the world on her own terms. Cats in Norse culture may have had associations with the domestic sphere, with the hearth and home, which connects back to Freyja's role as a goddess of fertility and marriage. But they also have a wild streak, a hunter's instinct, a fierce independence. Freyja's cats were not lap cats. They were powerful creatures who could pull her across the sky, and in that sense, they reflected her own duality. Domestic and wild, nurturing and ferocious, beautiful and untamable. Then there was Hildisvíni, the boar. This one is a bit more complicated. In one poem, the Hyndluljóð, Freyja is described as riding a boar named Hildisvíni, which means battle swine. Some sources suggest that Hildisvíni was actually Freyja's human lover, Ottar, transformed into a boar to accompany her on a journey. Others interpret the boar as a sacred animal associated with Freyja, much like her brother Freyr was associated with his golden bristled boar Gullinborsti. Boars were deeply symbolic in Norse culture. They represented strength, ferocity, and fertility. Boar imagery appeared on helmets, on shields, in sacrificial rituals. To ride a boar was to claim a kind of primal elemental power, and Freyja, who already commanded so much, added this to her array of symbols. There's also the question of her various names and epithets. Freyja, as we've said, is not actually a name but a title meaning lady. Her other names, Mardol, Horn, Gefn, Seir, Vanadis, each carry their own meanings and associations. Mardol might mean sea bright or shining over the sea, linking her to water and light. Horn, as mentioned, likely connects to flax and linen. Gefn means giver, tying her to generosity and abundance. Seir can be translated as sow, reinforcing her connection to fertility and boars, though some argue it means to protect. Vanadis simply means Lady of the Vanir, emphasizing her origins. And there are more, names that appear in poetry, in kennings, in fragments of lost lore. Each name was a facet, a different way of understanding the goddess, a reminder that she could not be reduced to a single identity or role. And then there's Friday. We touched on this earlier, but it's worth emphasizing. In Germanic languages, the day of the week we call Friday is named after Freyja, or possibly Frigg, or the Proto-Germanic goddess who gave rise to both. Fredag in Swedish, Freitag in German, Vrijdag in Dutch, Friday in English. Every week, across much of the world, we say her name, often without realizing it. Friday was her day, a day sacred to love, to magic, to the goddess who ruled over such things. And there's an old tradition, still remembered in some places, that Friday the 13th is especially sacred to Freyja, because 13 is her number. Whether you believe in such things or not, it's a reminder that Freyja's legacy persists in ways both obvious and hidden. And what about plants? In Scandinavia, before Christianity replaced the old beliefs, many plants were named after Freyja. Wildflowers, herbs, grasses, all carried her name as a mark of their beauty or their usefulness. But when Christian missionaries arrived, they systematically replaced Freyja's name with that of the Virgin Mary. Flowers that had been Freyja's hair became Mary's hair. Plants called Freyja's tears were renamed. The church could not allow people to invoke a pagan goddess every time they picked a flower or brewed a tea. So they substituted, erasing Freyja from the landscape, even as they preserved the traditions themselves. But in rural areas, in the deep countryside of Sweden and Norway, the old names persisted. Farmers and shepherds still whispered Freyja's name, left offerings for her, remembered her as a goddess of the land and the seasons. As late as the 19th century, there were accounts of people in Småland, a region in southern Sweden, who believed that Freyja would visit on Christmas night to bless the apple trees, ensuring a good harvest the next year. They would leave a few apples on the trees for her, a small gift to honor the goddess. And there were warnings too. Don't leave the plows outside, they said, because if Freyja sits on one, it will be ruined, cursed, useless. These folk beliefs, half remembered and Christianized as they were, showed that Freyja had not been forgotten. She lingered in the land in the rhythms of planting and reaping, in the turning of the seasons. Now, before we go further, we need to address one of the great mysteries of Norse mythology, one that scholars have debated for over a century. Who is Frigg, and what is her relationship to Freyja? Frigg is described in the sources as the wife of Odin, the queen of the Aesir, a goddess of marriage, motherhood, and wisdom. She is said to know the fate of all beings, but chooses never to reveal what she knows. She is associated with the domestic sphere, with weaving and spinning, with the protection of children. In many ways, she sounds quite different from Freyja. Frigg is the proper queen, the maternal figure, the wise counselor. Freyja is the passionate lover, the sorceress, the goddess of wild desires. But dig a little deeper and the lines start to blur. Both goddesses are connected to magic. Both have associations with spinning and weaving. Both are linked to Odin, Frigg as his wife, Freyja as his student, and possibly his lover. Both have halls in Asgard. And here's where it gets really interesting. The day of the week, Friday, is named after one of them, but the sources can't agree which. In Old English, it's Friggadaig, Frigg's Day. In Old Norse, it's Freyjadagar or Freyjudagar, which could refer to either goddess. It's as if the two names were interchangeable, or at least closely related. Many scholars now believe that Freyja and Frigg were originally the same goddess, or at least two forms of the same deity, who diverged over time. In the earliest layers of Germanic belief, there may have been a single great goddess, associated with love, fertility, magic, sovereignty, and wisdom. As the mythology evolved, this goddess split into two, Freyja retaining the more primal, Vanir-associated aspects, while Frigg took on the more refined, Aesir-associated roles. This would explain why their attributes overlap so much, why both are so important, why the sources sometimes seem confused about which goddess is which. It would also explain the connection between Oda and Odin. If Oda is Odin, and Freyja is married to Oda, then Freyja is in some sense Odin's wife, the same role that Frigg occupies. The two goddesses would be different faces of the same divine feminine, one emphasizing passion and magic, the other emphasizing wisdom and motherhood. Of course, not all scholars agree with this theory. Some argue that Freyja and Frigg are and always have been distinct deities, and that the similarities are just coincidences or the result of later confusion. But the theory has gained significant traction, and it's worth considering as we try to understand who Freyja really was. If Freyja and Frigg were originally one, then Freyja's story becomes even more complex. She would not just be the goddess of love and war, but also the queen of the gods, the ultimate feminine power in the Norse cosmos, split into different roles by the demands of storytelling and theology. And if that's true, then Freyja's influence on Norse culture was even greater than the surviving myths suggest. She was not just a goddess among many, but the goddess, the one whose power touched every aspect of life, from birth to death, from the harvest to the hall, from the forge to the battlefield. Whether or not this theory is correct, what's certain is that Freyja and Frigg both represent essential aspects of the divine feminine in Norse belief, and together they offer a vision of womanhood that is multifaceted, powerful, and impossible to reduce to a single archetype. They are mothers and lovers, queens and sorceresses, wise and wild. They are the full spectrum of what it means to be female, divine, or otherwise, and Freyja, as one half of this duality, stands as a reminder that women, whether mortal or immortal, contain multitudes. So what did the Vikings actually do with all of this? How did Freyja move from myth into practice, from story into worship? The evidence suggests that Freyja was not just a figure in tales told around the fire, but an active, living presence in the religious life of the Norse people. She was prayed to, honored, offered sacrifices. There are place names across Scandinavia that bear her name, farms and meadows and hills called Frovihof, Freyja's temple, or Froland, Freyja's land. These names suggest that there were actual shrines or sacred sites dedicated to her, places where people came to make offerings, to seek her blessing, to honor the goddess. Archaeological evidence is frustratingly sparse. The Vikings did not build massive stone temples like the Greeks or Romans. Their sacred sites were often made of wood, which has long since rotted away, or were simply natural features, groves of trees, springs, rocks, places where the boundary between the human world and the divine felt thin. But we do have some clues. There are small figurines, amulets, pendants that may represent Freyja or goddesses like her. There are references in sagas to people making offerings to Freyja, asking for her help in matters of love, fertility, or prosperity. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence comes from a grave found in Sweden, at a site called Hagaby Hoga in Östergötland. The grave belonged to a woman who was buried around the year 1000, right at the cusp of Christianization. She was buried with considerable wealth, horses, a wagon, an elaborate wand, and a silver pendant depicting a woman wearing a broad necklace. The grave is believed to be that of a Volva, a seeress who practiced seidr, and the pendant, with its depiction of a woman in a necklace, may well represent Freyja, the goddess who was the patroness of such women, the teacher of the magic they wielded. It's a tantalizing glimpse into how Freyja was honored, how her image was carried by those who walked in her footsteps. There are also references to Freyja in the sagas, those long prose narratives that recorded the history and legends of the Norse people. In one saga, a woman declares that she will refuse to eat until she joins Freyja, suggesting that people believed they could go to Freyja's hall after death, just as warriors went to Valhalla. In another, a character calls on Freyja for help in a matter of love, invoking her as a goddess who had power over such things. And then there's the evidence from the transition period, when Christianity was replacing the old beliefs. Christian missionaries and kings worked hard to suppress the worship of the Norse gods, tearing down temples, outlawing sacrifices, punishing those who clung to the old ways. But Freyja, it seems, was particularly hard to root out. The church fathers condemned her, calling her a demon, a temptress, the queen of witches. They associated her with everything they found threatening: female sexuality, non-Christian magic, the refusal to submit to patriarchal authority. And yet, people kept honoring her, even if they had to do it in secret, even if they had to disguise her under new names. The plants that had been sacred to her were renamed for the Virgin Mary, but the traditions around them persisted. The stories told about her were rewritten with Christian morals, but the core of who she was remained. Even in the 19th century, long after Scandinavia had been officially Christian for 800 years, there were still people in the countryside who knew Freyja's name, who told stories about her, who left offerings in her honor. This resilience says something important about Freyja. She was not a goddess who could be easily erased. She had been too important, too deeply woven into the fabric of Norse culture, too much a part of the way people understood the world, love, death, magic, fertility. All of these things are fundamental to human experience, and Freyja was the divine embodiment of them. You can change the names, you can condemn the practices, but you cannot remove the realities they represent. And so Freyja persisted in folk memory, in hidden traditions, in the whispered names of plants, and the stories grandmothers told their grandchildren. She survived because she had to, because the things she represented were too powerful to be suppressed. And then in the modern era, Freyja experienced a kind of resurrection. As scholars began to study Old Norse texts, as the sagas and Eddas were translated and published, Freyja's story reached a wider audience. Artists painted her, her golden hair streaming as she rode her cat-drawn chariot, her tears glittering as they fell. Writers incorporated her into novels and poems, reimagining her for new generations. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as movements like Romanticism and later neo-paganism took hold, Freyja became a symbol, a figure to rally around. For some, she represented female empowerment, a goddess who was unapologetically sexual, who wielded power on her own terms, who refused to be diminished by anyone. For others, she was a link to a pre-Christian past, a time when the divine feminine was honored, when magic and nature were seen as sacred. Today, Freyja is one of the most recognized figures from Norse mythology. She appears in video games, in fantasy novels, in television shows. She's been depicted as a warrior, a seductress, a queen, a witch. Some of these portrayals are thoughtful and nuanced, others are shallow or sensationalized, but all of them in their way keep her story alive. There are modern practitioners of heathenry, a neo-pagan movement that seeks to revive and honor the Old Norse gods, who worship Freyja as a living deity. They make offerings to her, celebrate festivals in her name, invoke her in rituals. For them, Freyja is not a relic of the past but a present force, a goddess who still has power, who still listens, who still walks among those who call on her. Whether or not you believe in the literal existence of gods, there's something profound about this continuity. A goddess first worshipped over 1,000 years ago, in a culture so different from our own, is still being honored today. Her story has adapted, evolved, taken on new meanings, but it has not been forgotten. And perhaps that's the greatest testament to Freyja's power. Not that she could choose the slain or weave fate or turn into a falcon, but that she could endure, that her story could survive centuries of suppression, of cultural change, of being rewritten and reimagined, and still resonate with people who hear it. Freyja endures because she touches something deep within us. The longing for love, the grief of loss, the desire for beauty, the need for power, the courage to face death. She is all of these things, wrapped in gold and tears and magic. And as long as people tell stories, as long as people search for meaning in the old myths, Freyja will be there, riding her chariot across the sky, weeping her golden tears, choosing the slain, teaching the secrets of fate to those brave enough to learn. So let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned. Freyja was a goddess of the Vanir, brought to Asgard as part of a peace agreement after a devastating war between two tribes of gods. She taught the Aesir the art of seidr, a form of magic so powerful it could alter fate itself, and in doing so she changed the very nature of the gods. She was a goddess of love, beauty, and fertility, invoked by those seeking passion, abundance, and the blessings of the earth. But she was also a goddess of war and death, choosing half of the slain warriors to join her in Folkvanger, her hall of many seats. She acquired Brísingamen, a necklace of unparalleled beauty, through a bargain that has been debated for centuries. She wept tears of gold for her lost husband Odr, wandering the 9 realms in search of him. her grief transforming into treasure. She rode a chariot pulled by cats, wore a cloak of falcon feathers, and was associated with boars and sacred plants. She was called by many names, each one a different facet of her nature, and she endured even after the coming of Christianity, even after her temples were destroyed and her name was condemned. She survived in folk memory, in place names, in the traditions that people refused to abandon, and she has returned, reimagined and revitalized in the modern world. Freyja is not an easy goddess. She doesn't fit neatly into categories. She's not the gentle mother goddess or the chaste maiden or the wise crone. She's all of those things and none of them, a figure of contradictions who refuses to be simplified. She loves and she grieves. She creates and she destroys. She is beautiful and terrible, nurturing and fierce. She embodies the full complexity of the feminine divine, and in doing so, she challenges us to think more deeply about what divinity means. The Greeks had Aphrodite, goddess of love, and Athena, goddess of wisdom, and Artemis, goddess of the hunt. Each was a separate deity, a distinct archetype. But Freyja contains all of these roles within herself. She is love and wisdom, and the wild hunt, all at once, all inseparable. And perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the Norse understood something that other cultures did not, that the sacred cannot be divided into neat little boxes, that the forces that shape our lives are messy and contradictory and impossible to fully comprehend. Freyja is a goddess for people who understand that life is complicated, that you can be strong and vulnerable, that you can seek power and still grieve, that you can be sexual and spiritual, fierce and loving all at the same time. And her story reminds us that the past is never truly dead. The gods of our ancestors, whether we believe in them literally or metaphorically, still have something to teach us. They offer frameworks for understanding ourselves, for making sense of the world, for finding meaning in the chaos. Freyja's tears falling as gold tell us that even our pain can be transformed into something beautiful. Her search for odor reminds us that longing is part of love, that we cannot possess what we cherish, that we must keep seeking even when the search seems hopeless. Her mastery of seidr shows us that knowledge is power, but also that power comes with a cost, that to see the threads of fate is to bear the weight of that vision. Her choice of the slain teaches us that death is not the end, that those we lose are not forgotten, that there is honor in how we face our final moments. And her very existence, defiant and enduring, tells us that the sacred feminine in all its forms will not be silenced. You can suppress it, rename it, condemn it, but it will survive. It will return. It will demand to be acknowledged. So as we come to the end of tonight's journey, I want to leave you with this. Freyja is not just a character in an old myth. She is a living force, a presence that has walked through the centuries, adapting and surviving and remaining relevant. Whether you see her as a goddess to be worshipped, a symbol to be honored, or simply a fascinating figure from the past, she has something to offer. She reminds us that we are more than one thing, that we contain multitudes, that we do not have to choose between strength and softness, between passion and wisdom, between the fierce and the tender. We can be all of it, just as she is. And maybe in our own lives, we can find a way to channel a bit of Freyja's spirit, to pursue what we desire with boldness, to weep when we must, knowing that our tears are golden, to seek knowledge even when it challenges us, to honor the dead even as we celebrate the living, to refuse to be diminished, to stand in our power, to walk through the world as if we too were divine. The myths tell us that Freyja still rides across the sky, that her chariot still moves between the realms, that her tears still fall as gold. I don't know if that's literally true, but I know that her story endures. I know that people still tell it, still find meaning in it, still see themselves in her journey, and that in its own way is a kind of magic. So thank you for joining me tonight. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the mythology of Freyja, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe if you want more stories like this, and let me know in the comments what other myths you'd like to explore. Until next time, may your dreams be golden, may your magic be strong, and may you walk your path with the courage of the goddess herself. Good night. Good.